Well, thank you very much, Greti, and thanks too to the Institute, which is a quite wonderful place to work, I must say. I've been to many places, but I think in terms of a stimulating and enjoyable environment, it really comes at the very top. And thanks to the partners who support the Institute, of course, the Ville de Paris has been very important in that. Well, my talk today is about the quality of work and psychosocial risks. And this is a theme which, to my mind, is becoming increasingly important on the policy agenda. If we take the period since 2010, what one's seen is that many international organizations have been at work trying to create better indicators for following, monitoring changes in the quality of work over time. But perhaps most important of all, in 2015, the G20 employment and labour ministers made a declaration about the need for policies to improve job quality. And this was later endorsed by the G20 Leaders Summit. And they set in train a whole process of trying to plan ways of monitoring job quality better in various countries of the G20, and to develop policies which would improve job quality. And I'll show you an extract from that declaration, because I think it's very interesting. They say, "We emphasise the importance of promoting better jobs, since the quality of working life is one of the most powerful determinants of well-being in our societies." So there's an immediate link between job quality and well-being. "We understand that a comprehensive policy approach will be required to make progress in all three dimensions of job quality: earnings quality, economic security, and quality of the working environment." And I think that's interesting too, because it's saying that issues about the nature of work and work organisation are critical to understand if we want to understand well-being. And it concludes, "And we are committed to make progress in the different areas according to country circumstances." So I think that was a very important declaration, and of course it'll take time for its consequences to work through, but it's worth watching very closely. Now, my presentation is going to be structured around three main sections. In the first, I want to look at the concepts and theories which are going to inform the talk, about the concepts and theories about the quality of work on the one hand and psychosocial risks on the other. And in the second section, I want to turn to a comparison of the change in risk factors in France and Britain, and I'll explain later why I think that's a really interesting thing to do. And in the third section, I want to look more generally at the policy implications of the work on psychosocial risk factors, what one might do to try to prevent and reduce these problems. So taking first section one, the quality of work and psychosocial risks, concepts and theories. Now, what is a good quality working environment? And there are hundreds of books written on this, but I think if one was to take a very broad overview, most of the conclusions can actually be summed up by two basic principles. The first is that a good quality working environment is one that provides opportunities for self-development through the exercise of initiative and learning at work. And this is, for 100 years, in a sense, this has informed the debate about the nature of the work environment. And the second, which has perhaps been somewhat more recent in terms of essentiality, is a good quality working environment protects and enhances psychological and physical health. And of course, it's the second of these which brings us directly into the issues of today, of psychosocial risks. And what are psychosocial risks? Well, there are quite a lot of interpretations of what psychosocial risks are, in especially the policy literature. But I think the most interesting consideration of this was actually done in France, because after the wave of suicides in France Telecom in 2009, there was commission set up to really examine the causes of this and to recommend ways of monitoring better psychosocial risks at work. And that was called the Gallie Commission. And it brought together experts from quite diverse disciplines to consider what is the best way of thinking about these issues and of trying to do something about them. And the Gallie Commission defines psychosocial risks as, and this happens to be in French, so this is an advantage, risques pour la santé mentale, physique et sociale, engendrés par les conditions d'emploi et les facteurs organisationnels et relationnels susceptibles d'interagir avec le fonctionnement mental. So I think I'm going to take that as really the most official of our existing definitions of psychosocial risks. It is, of course, quite complex. So what are its implications? Well, I think the first thing to notice is that the emphasis is primarily on risks deriving from the work context rather than the individual. And this made a break with the previous emphasis on work stress. Because one of the problems I think people encountered with the concept of work stress was that it was very multidimensional in the way it was handled. And people could emphasize one thing or another, and the concept could become very fluid. But increasingly, the emphasis was upon the individual as the source of work stress. It was the fragility of the individual which was considered to be a problem. Now, the emphasis on psychosocial risks places the emphasis primarily on the work context. Now, that's not to say that there isn't an individual component. Individuals may be more or less resilient faced by demands at work, but it's secondary, in effect. And crucially, the effects of the work context can and have been shown to be still present even when you control for a wide range of personality factors. Now, the development of thinking about psychosocial risks has taken place in a context where I think there was quite a wide consensus about the way in which the risk structure at work was shifting over time. And the scenario here was that due to sectoral change, particularly the shift from manufacturing industry to service industries, and due to improved regulation, there's been a decline in physical risks at work. But this doesn't mean that risks overall have declined. Rather, we've seen an increase in a different sort of risks, psychosocial risks, which stem largely from the growth of work intensity, but also from the increase in work which involves social interaction. Let's say work on people, with people, clients, customers, patients, students. That this type of work is somehow inherently more problematic in terms of psychosocial risks. Now, I would say that we should be somewhat cautious about taking this overall idea that one type of risk is disappearing and replaced by a new type of risk. It is true that there's been a marked fall in fatal accidents at work. I mean, if you look at the graph, it's really very, very striking. And that's been going on for the better part of the century, and of course started with the decline of mining and shipping as key industries. But if you look carefully at the data, some types of physical risks still remain very present at work. So there's been very little change in the risks of injury through heavy lifting, repetitive movements, exposure to biological and chemical risks. These are very persistent. So it's not entirely true that all physical risks are on the way out. They seem to be quite persistent. And for the second term, I think we have to admit that very little is known about long-term changes in psychosocial risks. They may have been present and just as powerful at earlier historical periods, but we simply don't have data. And I think, what we have data about is a relatively recent period. We can make statements about change over a relatively recent period, but we can't easily make long-term statements about the rise of new types of risks. Now, there can be quite diverse sources of psychosocial risks at work. But the literature, the research literature, has been dominated by two major scenarios, two major theories of psychosocial risk. The longest standing, and I think probably the one which has got the greatest research evidence behind it, is demand control theory. This was developed by Robert Karasek and then further elaborated by Robert Karasek and Thirl. You should all have bibliographies, I hope, so you don't need to sort of write these names down. But if you want to go back and look at these texts later, I really do recommend it. I mean, Karasek's book is the Karasek and Thirl is a great classic in the field. And this theory emphasized the importance of employees' control over decisions about their work tasks as a moderator of work pressure. And the second very influential theory, although starting somewhat later, is a theory developed by Johannes Siegrist called effort-reward imbalance theory. And this emphasizes the importance of reciprocity between job demands and rewards. And rewards are taken as including not only income, but status, and particularly job security. And I think what is interesting is both of these theories have actually focused on two major outcomes of psychosocial risks. Their effects with respect to depression on the one hand, and with respect to physical health, their effects on the risks of coronary heart disease. So this is where a lot of the research has been going on in the last 2 or 3 decades. Now, just to expand a bit on the theories, the Karasek-Thirl theory basically has two categories: job demands, which are primarily understood in terms of the levels of work effort and the time pressure people experience at work. Time pressure is very important in these theories, and I think probably accounts for lots of other types of pressure that people experience. And job control, which is job control in the sense of how much you can determine your everyday activities at work. Are you in charge of deciding what to do about the work task, or are you simply obeying orders? And the argument here is that depending on whether you have high or low control, your reaction, your response to job demands will be quite different. So in the event that you have high control, having high job demands can be quite a good thing. It can be quite challenging. You have to find creative responses to these demands. So it could be a source of self-development. It's where you're faced by a situation of where high demands coincide with low control that you're really facing the important psychological and physical risks. That you have these demands, but you can't escape from them, you can't do anything about them, you're trapped. You're trapped over the long term. It's not easy to get out of these situations. And this is where the real problems build in. These are sort of intermediate categories, but the theory argues that passive jobs are not very good for you either, because you don't actually develop at all, and you become rather stagnant as a person. So that's the essence of the job control model, which is one which I'm going to refer to quite a lot in the talk. So it's good if you keep that clearly in mind. The effort-reward imbalance model starts from a rather different point of view. It starts from the importance to people of the norm of reciprocity. And there's a huge literature which shows this is very important to people. It argues that feeling that there is this reciprocity is crucial for well-being. Again, effort is conceived primarily in terms of time pressures deriving from the work environment. But Siegrist also builds in a secondary source of pressure, which is more linked to personality factors, which he terms overcommitment. He would argue that some people have got very high needs for achievement, and this adds to the sense of pressure that they experience in work. So it's a slightly hybrid model, but nonetheless the primary emphasis is upon the work environment. And finally, as I mentioned before, the rewards include income recognition and job security. And I think a particular emphasis should be placed on job security, because there's now a very substantial literature on the psychological effects of job insecurity. And indeed, job insecurity has been shown to have effects of psychological distress, which are very similar to that of unemployment itself. If you're in a job with chronic job insecurity, it leads to levels of anxiety and depression which are comparable to that experienced by the unemployed. So it's a very important issue. Now, actually, testing whether or not these psychosocial risks have the effects which they are thought to have for health is a very tricky thing to do. You need extremely good data. You need longitudinal studies which follow individuals over quite long periods of time. And you need to be able to rule out the fact that the effects are due to stable differences in people's personalities or motivation. So you need to be able to really show that it's the work context which is doing the work. You need evidence, ideally, which shows that increased exposure to these risks leads to increased problems in terms of health. So the more frequently you experience them, or the longer you're in a situation where these risks are present, the worse your outcomes will be. You need evidence that shows that these risks are not just confined to particular sectors of the workforce, but rather are quite general across different types of employees. And finally, ideally, you would want to see that these results can be replicated in different cultures and are not simply specific to the cultural motives of particular societies. Now, these are very demanding requirements of data. But in both cases, in demand control theory and in effort-reward imbalance theory, I think they've done a very good job at creating these data sets which have followed individuals over very long periods of time, and the replication of the results is remarkably consistent. So we have really quite good data, and it's taken about 3 decades to build it up. Now, if we take the evidence on the demand control model, longitudinal studies show that job strain, which is a situation where you have high job demands but low control, that very problematic quadrant of the chart I showed you, increases risk of depression, high blood pressure, heart disease, and indeed death from heart disease. And I've given you the citations if you want to follow those up. With respect to depressive symptoms, the estimated increased risk from meta-analyses are analyses which bring together the whole range of studies which have been carried out and make adjustments for the strength of the data. But the estimated increase in risk of depression is about 74% for people who are located in a high job strain situation as against those who are not. And with respect to heart disease, the meta-analysis estimates indicate that job strain raises the risk of heart disease by about 30%. So these are really quite substantial health effects and things that we should be really concerned about. If we turn to the evidence on the effort-reward imbalance model, the effect estimates from longitudinal studies are very comparable to those for demand control. I think this is what is interesting. If you put both models into the same analyses, they actually have independently significant effects. So both are adding something. And of course, if you have both, then your risk increases yet more. So I think there's now very good, very solid, consistent evidence about the psychological and physical health effects of these work context factors. So summary, the key risk factors, as I see it coming out of the literature so far, are work pressure on the one hand, lack of control over the immediate job task, what I'm going to call task discretion for the rest of the talk, and finally job insecurity. And these are the factors which I shall look at in the next section. So turning to section 2, a comparison of change in psychosocial risk factors in France and Britain. Now, I choose the period 2005 because 2005 was just before the economic crisis and 2015 is the most recent data we've got. The 2015 data is really recent, and I've been working on a pre-public version of it. So it's tentative, but I think it shows some very interesting results. Now, why a comparison of France and Britain? What's interesting about comparing these two countries? Well, as a sociologist, I start from the fact there's been a long-standing debate about the relative importance of economic and institutional factors as determinants of the quality of the work environment. Some people would say, well, it's just a matter basically of the level of economic development of countries, whereas others would say, no, what's crucial is the particular institutional configuration which has built up historically in countries over time and influences the structure of work and its outcomes. So the interesting thing about England and France, Britain and France, is that these are two market economies at a broadly similar level of economic development, but they have very distinctive institutional characteristics. And if we take the economic pattern, you can see that GDP per capita is broadly similar in the two countries. The change over the period shows some differences. You can see that Britain took a steeper fall over the period of the economic crisis, 2005 to 2010. The collapse of GDP per capita was somewhat sharper, but then the recovery after 2012 was somewhat faster too. So you have differences, but basically these are countries at a broadly similar level of economic development. There's a quite marked difference in labour productivity per hour worked, about 25% between France and Britain, with labour productivity notably higher in France, which some people put down to a production strategy which is more focused on higher skilled workers and also higher levels of capital intensiveness. But as you can see, that's been very consistent across the period. It might lead you to expect that any pressures that occur in Britain would be more on the low-skilled than in France, given the difference in production strategies. And third, we can notice a difference in unemployment rates, where France has persistently had higher unemployment than Britain. And you can see that that's actually been diverging increasingly over this period of 2013 to 2015. And that again could be linked to these differences in employment strategies, that if you have a production strategy focused more on low-skilled work, this may be more favourable to employment levels than one which focuses more on technological investment. So, if we take the economic scene, the UK had a somewhat stronger initial economic shock, but it recovered more strongly after 2010. The pattern suggests that French employers have followed a more capital-intensive strategy at the cost, perhaps, of higher unemployment, and British employers have relied more on a low-skill, low-cost production strategy, which may support higher employment levels. So economically, I would argue these are very similar societies, but they've had somewhat different phasings of development. But they have very considerable institutional differences. So to start with the macro-institutional differences, the ones which are really at national level, the UK is usually taken as an example of what we call liberal market capitalism in the literature. That's a form of capitalism where there's very low regulative control over what employers can do. Whereas France is normally referred to as a state-coordinated capitalism, where you get stronger regulation, partly as a result of collective bargaining between the social partners, but often on the initiative of the state intervening to trigger off the collective bargaining process, and of course also using the power of law to introduce regulative control. Now, in the literature, coordinated market economies are thought to adopt higher skilled, more technologically intensive production strategies, which fits with what I've shown you earlier about the differences in labour productivity. And the French also have stronger regulative control of collective bargaining, employee representation, training provision, working time, redundancies, and minimum pay. So there's much stronger regulation of many spheres of work and employment in France. But, and this is a very big but, it also has a more dualistic employment structure. So much of that regulation is particularly advantageous for those in permanent jobs, and the terms of employment for those in temporary work are substantially less good. One of the interesting facts about the differences of the country I saw in one of the Institute's newsletters, that France has 18.9 labour inspectors per 100,000 workers, whereas the UK has 0.9, which shows something about the importance attached to regulation, I think, in the two countries. Now, it's not only at the macro level, but there are differences in the workplace and the way the workplace operates and the relationship between the workplace and the company, in the two companies. And there's a very good book here, which has come out recently, by Thomas Abossé and his colleagues, Comparative Workplace Employment Relations, Analysis of Practice in Britain and France, and I would recommend that to you. And this is based upon surveys of employers. And it shows there are very important differences at company level in the centralisation of decision-making and in employee voice. So decision-making about both employment issues and pay is considerably more centralised in France. And to give you an idea of the differences, with respect to employment decisions, whether or not to hire people or fire people, 87% of workplaces have local decision-making autonomy in the UK. And that compares with 30% in France. So these are huge differences in the way in which workplaces and companies operate. Or take employee voice. If you take both union and non-union representatives, 53% of French workplaces have an employee representative. And these cover roughly 82% of employees. In contrast, only 19% of British workplaces have an employee representative. And these cover only 48% of employees. So in terms of the formal structure of voice, France has got much more pervasive voice. But in Britain, much more goes on informally at the local level, in the workplace. So what one finds is that British workplaces are much more likely to consult employees directly. The managers of the local workplace will consult their employees directly, either through team meetings or opinion surveys. So 45% of British workplaces, compared to 21% of French, use employee attitude surveys as one indicator of this difference. So you have much more informal, direct involvement in the much stronger regulated formal representation in France. There's also a considerable difference between the countries in the institutional support for the prevention of psychosocial risks. Now, in the UK, the responsibility for keeping an eye on psychosocial risks is allocated to the Health and Safety Executive, which basically issues guidelines about voluntary management standards. It said, look, if you're a good manager, this is the way you should be treating your workforce. But it tried also to monitor over time what was happening to these risk factors with a set of surveys which started in 2004. But what is interesting is that these surveys were discontinued in 2010. And there's been subsequently no official monitoring of psychosocial risks. What happened in 2010? Well, the Labour government fell and a Conservative Liberal coalition took its place. And the abolition of these surveys was clearly part of the new agenda. In France, we find a very different pattern. After the wave of work-related suicides, first in Renault and then in France Telecom, the Ministre du Travail, Emploi et Santé set up the College d'Expertise, which I mentioned earlier, the GOLEC Commission, which successfully recommended a major extension of risk monitoring through large-scale representative surveys, which are going on. The major survey going on this year. You may get interviewed at some point. So, and from 2010, obligatory negotiations started in 1,500 firms, of large firms which have 1,000 plus employees, on ways of reducing risk. So it's a very different pattern. From 2010, Britain was cutting its monitoring process, whereas France was accelerating it. And I think that this is an important difference in the country. So issues, did the more centralised and regulated state capitalist regime in France protect employees better from the effects of the economic crisis and its aftermath on work intensity and task discretion than the decentralised liberal market economy in Britain. And perhaps the second issue is, did the dualistic labour market in France, with strong employment protection for insiders, but high proportions of temporary workers, lead to higher or lower levels of job insecurity than the deregulated British labour market? So let's look at the data. Now, the data I'm going to use draws on the European Working Conditions surveys, which are carried out by Eurofound. And they're carried out roughly every 5 years. And I'm taking surveys 2005, 2010, and 2015. Now, these surveys are representative surveys of the workforce in each country in Europe. You can see they give us an overview of conditions across the workforce, of people in quite different occupations, quite different industries across the country. I'm going to base the analysis purely on employees, so I'm leaving out the self-employed in these analyses, but there are self-employed in the sample, although they're relatively small numbers. Now, what are the indicators that I've used? The European Working Conditions Survey has 3 main indicators which capture work pressure. There's the 2 dimensions that we primarily want to get here are work pressure on the one hand and job control in terms of the demand control model. So they ask, does your job involve working at very high speed and working to tight deadlines? And do you have enough time to get the job done? Now, these are quite simple measures, but these are the measures which have been shown to predict quite substantial health differences over time for employees. So they're obviously quite powerful. They're capturing something, I would have thought, in order to be able to show effects as strong as the ones which we saw before. I've created an overall work pressure index, which is the average score of the standardized items. And in terms of task discretion, this the immediate control of your job that I mentioned, that there are 3 items. Are you able to choose or change your order of tasks, your methods of work, your speed or rate of work? And again, I've created an average score across the 3 items. So to look at the way these have been changing over time, and I think this is really a very interesting pattern. I want you first of all to look at the changes between 2005 and 2010. I think what you can see here is that the level of work pressure rose substantially more in France than it did in Britain. I mean, it rose in both countries, but the increase was more in the blue column, which is France, than the red column, which is Britain. And then if you turn to the chart over here, the chart of task discretion or controlled work, what you see is, again, there's a difference of pattern. In face of increasing work pressure, control at work in Britain increased. But look what happened in France. There was a decline. So over this period between 2005 and 2010, France managed to combine increasing work pressure with decreasing control at work, which, of course, is exactly what the demand control model would predict would be very bad in terms of psychosocial risks and the impact on people's health. And of course, this was the period in which the wave of work-related suicides took place. Now look again at the second comparison, 2010 to 2015. What happens in 2010 to 2015 is that work pressure actually levels off or possibly declines in France. But in Britain, it soars. So in Britain, you've simply got a sort of continuing increase in work pressure. Whereas in France, you have this curved pattern. It goes up to 2010, but then levels off or slightly declines. And if you take task discretion, that increases in both countries, and in a sense, it becomes very similar in the 2 countries. So something seems to have changed in France after 2010. And I think this is really interesting. Why and how does this relate to the policy initiatives that were taken, the beginnings of collective bargaining, the greater awareness about psychosocial risks that was being in France rather than in Britain at the time. So in France, we've seen that the period 2005, declining task discretion, particularly sharp rise in work intensity. I suspect increased psychosocial risks more than in Britain. But there was this change after 2010 with the continued rise of work pressure in Britain. But in France, there was a levelling off. And I think these change in trends in France in this period are consistent with the view that policy initiatives may have had a preventative effect in a more centralised institutional structure. Now turning to the issue of job insecurity, which of course underlies the effort to reward imbalance model. Now I'm going to take two sets of figures, one on the temporary work, on the prevalence of temporary work, and the other an insecurity indicator from the European Working Conditions Survey, which simply asks people, to what extent do you agree or disagree that I might lose my job in the next 6 months? Now you see this difference in pattern here. This is the dualistic labour market. You see, again, the blue columns are France, the red columns are Britain. You see that temporary work has been persistently much more prevalent in France than in Britain. There's not a great deal of change over time, but there's some sign of it rising within the period 2010 to 2015. But did this mean insecurity was greater? I think what you have to remember about Britain, in a deregulated economy, in a deregulated employment structure, it's much easier for employers to fire workers. And in some sense, one of the arguments about temporary work is that it's so difficult to reduce the services of people in permanent contracts that you hire temporary workers who are easier to dispose of in a situation where you might have market volatility. So British employers have got easier powers to hire and fire. And they've also introduced other interesting tricks to the game, one of which you may have heard of here, which is zero-hour contracts. These are where you issue permanent employees with a contract, but you don't specify the number of hours they have to work. And this can have interesting consequences because they may learn that next week there are no hours to work. They're still employees, they're still permanent employees, but they have no hours to work and no income coming from that. So in some sense, British employers have got other ways of introducing insecurity. And I think you can see that this is, but basically it averages out. There's not a great deal of difference between the two countries in levels of job insecurity, despite the very substantial institutional differences in terms of formal contract status. So summary, well, we can see that the actual structure of the labour market is very different formally, with more high proportion of temporary contracts in France. Insecurity rose sharply in both countries between 2005 and 2010. But broadly speaking, these different institutional structures led to very similar outcomes in terms of job insecurity. So from those broad patterns, I want to now turn to the issue of which employees were most exposed to psychosocial risks, because those are, of course, very broad average trends in the two countries. But you might also get differences in terms of who's most affected, and these may be related to institutional structures. And I'm going to focus particularly on demand control factors, as these represented, as we've seen, the principal differences in risk factors between the countries. There was more difference in the pattern with respect to work pressure and task discretion than with respect to insecurity. And for the analysis, I'm taking an operational definition of jobs with psychosocial risks as jobs which were above the median for the EU 27 countries as a whole in 2005 with respect to work intensity, but below the median with respect to task discretion or job control. So these are people in that quadrant. They've got high demands, but low control. And we'll look at the proportions of them and how those proportions changed across time for different categories of employee. So I want to start first with the differences in, between occupational classes. And we start off in 2005, and I've chosen 2005 as a breakpoint because I want to see, in a sense, the change since 2005. And I'm taking as the definition of occupational classes quite simply the most used International Standard Classification of Occupations, ISCO, and dividing occupations between managers and professionals, technicians and associate professionals, clerical, service and sales, skilled manual, and the lower skilled, which include operators and so-called elementary workers. And here's the pattern, here's the beginning pattern, the pattern as it was in 2005. Now, quite often it's said that the highest degree of work stress is among higher skilled employees. But that's not the case with psychosocial risks. And the reason for this is quite simply that although work pressure is very high for those in higher skilled positions, so too is job control. So these are people who are under high pressure but have quite substantial control over how they do their work. Oops. So you can see here that there's certainly significant proportions of employees in the managerial professional group who experience high pressure. But by far the clearest concentration of these very high risk jobs are among those in low skilled work, and in France also among those in skilled manual work, and in Britain among those in clerical work. Now, how did the picture change? This is the picture 2005. How did it change over the subsequent period? Well, this shows you the change in the proportion of those in jobs with high work pressure and low task discretion between 2005 and 2010, the first of our two time periods. And as you can see, the increase was substantially stronger for all employees in France, and that we saw on the earlier chart. But I think the other interesting thing is the spread of occupational categories that were affected. You see, it's not just the low-skilled and service and sales, but also clerical employees and technicians and associate professionals, all affected by the rise in these sorts of difficult work conditions. Whereas in Britain, it was much more concentrated in the manual working class, among the low-skilled service and sales and skilled manual. So that was the picture. And have a this is, I think, particularly important to see this increase among those categories, because if we then look at the picture between 2005 and 2015, the overview of the whole period we're looking at, you can see actually that's gone sharply down in France. So the people, in a sense, who benefited most from the changes that came in 2010 were those in more highly skilled positions. What is noticeable is that workers in service and sales benefited very little from the changes after 2010. The level of pressure combined with low control for that group remained very similar. And I don't know the background of that, but I'm very interested if people in the audience could have views about why that group seems to have been so poorly protected in France compared to other categories of the workforce. In Britain, what you see is, of course, that the low-skilled bore the brunt of the overall change, which is very much what you'd expect, given the argument that Britain is an economy which sort of drives its wealth through intensifying the work for the low-skilled, rather than through capital investment supporting higher-skilled employees. So, and of course, the other notable thing, which again captures what we said at the very beginning, is that in France, over the whole period, the average increase, the workforce as a whole, in these high-strain jobs was very small. Whereas in Britain, we've seen quite a substantial expansion of that group. So that's occupation, and I want to look in turn at sex differences, contract differences, and sector differentials. Well, the sex differences, and this again shows an interesting difference in pattern, I think, if you look at the two time periods. If you just look at 2005 to 2010, it's clear that men basically bore the greater brunt in both countries of the period of the recession, 2005 to 2010. But if you look at the longer period, 2005 to 2015, you can see that whereas actually there's very little difference for men in France, if you take 2015 and compare with 2005, for women, there's been an overall increase. Similarly, if you take the British case, you can see actually for women, the psychosocial risks seem to have declined over that period, but they went up quite sharply in 2015. Whereas for men, again, there was some decline. And what you've seen in Britain is that from an initial situation where there was quite a difference with women having less exposure to such risks than men, by the end of the period, they're in virtually the same position. There's been a convergence of men and women's jobs in terms of their exposure to risk. If we now turn to the difference between those on permanent and temporary contracts, I think what again is striking, if we take the first period, there was of course a rise in the risk levels for both permanent and temporary employees, but look at the difference. Temporary workers clearly took the brunt of the effects of that period. And although both came down quite sharply in the subsequent period, you can see that whereas for permanent employees they returned more or less to levels of 2005, temporary employees didn't. So the level of risk remained substantially higher at the end of the period compared to the beginning. If we look at Britain, now you've got to be very careful here because given that there are a few temporary employees in Britain, the sample numbers are very small. And these figures I'm not sure I would take terribly seriously. At best, I think they show us that there was no overall long-term increase for temporary employees. But what is noticeable, and here the sample numbers are quite good, is that for permanent employees, there was a progressive increase in Britain, which you don't find in France. So the pressures just built on and built on the permanent employed workforce, whereas in France, they were turned back to some degree. And now looking at sector differences and comparing between the private and the public sector, and I put joint public-private together with the public for this purpose, but I'll show you the difference later. Here you can see that it is the private sector in France which saw the more substantial increase in risks over the initial period, and that dropped again. The public sector saw an increase to a less extent, and the drop was greater. In Britain, we can see that the private sector again increased, but as we saw in the previous charts, this increase just went on relentlessly across the two time periods. But the public sector shows a rather different pattern in France. The initial decrease, but then an increase compared to 2005. So overall, the reforms in France, or the measures to try to reduce psychosocial stress, seem to have been particularly efficacious in the public sector, whereas in Britain, the introduction, I think, of new public management reform meant that pressures overall went up to a greater degree. You've got to be very careful now, as I say, about sample numbers. And the public sector is very diverse. I mean, I think Elizabeth Algarve, for instance, has shown that if you take the fonction publique hospitalière, you get much higher levels of work pressure than in other sectors of the public sector. I want to make a different distinction, which is between the joint public-private and the pure public. But the sample numbers are small, so be cautious here. But I think that the pattern is interesting. That if you take the differences in France, you can see here that the private sector obviously rose very strongly. The level of pressure on the private sector in terms of these risks rose very strongly. Not so much for the public sector taken as the pure public sector, but a very substantial risk for those who were in organizations which were jointly public-private. And that, again, I think could link to the issue of the wave of suicides that hit France at the same time. In 2015, you can see that there was a decline primarily in the public sector for both parts, but the private sector remained much higher. So one needs to be careful about these very broad sectoral divisions because there is significant variation within them. But what is the overall pattern about the risk propensity? Well, in France, we can see that those over the longer period who were affected were service and sales. In Britain, it was the low-skilled. Women saw an increase in risk in both countries. In France, it was temporary workers in terms of contract. In Britain, it was permanent workers. And I think that clearly reflects the dualistic nature of the French labour market as against the British. And in France, it was the private sector that was primarily affected, whereas in Britain it was both the private and the public sector. And that, again, I suspect, reflects institutional differences, with the state playing a much more protective role, at least so far, of the public sector than in Britain, where it tried to introduce market principles into the organisation of the public sector, and of course slashed the number of employees in the public sector in the period 2010 to 2015. So that's the basic picture of the developments in the two countries. And I think what they show is that there are quite significant institutional differences, both in the overall trends and in the types of employees who are affected as a result of those institutional differences. But what can one do about all this? Well, there's an extensive literature on this, and that literature divides really into two broad groups. One which emphasizes individualistic solutions, and the other which looks at collectivist solutions. And the advocates of these don't see eye to eye. Individualistic solutions are basically divided into those who say, well, the way to get rid of psychosocial risks is really to select individuals more carefully for particular jobs. If you carried out a decent recruitment process, there wouldn't be a problem. You'd get the people who could fit those jobs, and the fragile would be put to jobs which the fragile can cope with. The second individualistic solution is, well, if you are in a workforce and you see people in difficulty, give them lots of individual help. Get them to see counsellors, psychotherapists, build up their defence mechanisms against the problems they're facing at work so they can cope with them better. The collectivists say, well, one solution is to improve the collective coping capacity, as I say, the sorts of aid that people can get from work groups at work, informal work groups. A second says, well, increase employee voice and involvement in decisions about work organisation. And the third says, well, increase regulative control of risks. As I say, greater intervention at state level and by the state partners at national level. Well, to take first selection and individual coping, and there's a very good book here by Yves Clos and Michel Golac, quite an interesting combination. It's very rare to see a book which is co-written by a psychologist and a sociologist. You can sometimes see the breaks, but it's an interesting piece of thinking. Le travail peut-il devenir supportable? And they give the individualistic solutions quite a hard deal. So if we take first the use of selection policies, those who advocate the use of selection policies, better selection policies, of course, emphasize the variability in individual responses to work stresses. And they have the belief that more fragile individuals can be detected through personality or other tests. So you could, in fact, sift them out at the point of recruitment. But Clos and Golac argue that this is really quite illusory, because the statistical correlation between personality factors and reactions to risk factors is simply too imprecise to select people carefully. It's an average and a weak average effect. And that means that there's a lot of variability around that average. So your chances of getting things right are really rather slim. But they also make a couple of ethical arguments, which is that selection on personality grounds is likely to be stigmatic in its effects and lead to systematic exclusion of individuals from employment. As employment structures generally become more demanding, the same individuals are going to be hit by the same selection procedures and will eventually find themselves marginalized from employment. And of course, exclusion is not without its social costs. Exclusion will lead to increased psychological distress, which will increase costs to the wider welfare system in the longer run. So this is in some sense an illusory savings. Companies may benefit in the shorter term if it were to work, but the costs are simply passed over to society at large. What about improving individual coping, this sort of provision of counselling help and so on to individuals? Well, it's premised on the belief in the efficacy of counselling of individuals to better withstand the pressures of the job by changes in their perceptions and attitudes. You can make them think more positively about work conditions that they found very disagreeable. You can give them more self-confidence. Now, I think there can be no doubt that it may help individuals adapt to their situation. This type of support may be helpful in the shorter term. But Chloe and Bollock made the argument that there are real limits to the extent to which changes in perceptions and attitudes can really dissolve the effects of real pressures at work, and therefore their harmful effects. You know, there's a limit to which you can adjust people into positive thinking if the work conditions are really very harsh. The truth will come home sooner or later. And when it does come home, it could have some quite perverse effects, because people who have been receiving all this help may feel feelings of individual failure when they realise they still can't cope despite all this. And further, it's a sort of use of resources which diverts attention from actually trying to improve the source of the problems, the underlying problems which have caused the difficulties in the first place. So passing over to collective coping, and here there's a very interesting book by Marc Loriol, Le temps de fatigue, la gestion sociale du mal-être dans le travail, and also an article, Collective Forms of Coping and the Social Construction of Work Stress among Industrial Workers and Police Officers in France. And this emphasises the vital role that work groups can play in helping individuals to cope with the pressures of working. And he argues that they can do this in different ways. They can help define problems as normal rather than just individual. You know, it's not just your problem, but we're all suffering from this. So, you know, you shouldn't feel particularly bad about it yourself. It can reduce stresses through cooperative problem solving, that people can share ideas about the best way to get around the difficulties they're faced. It can reduce people can work together to reduce the consequences of negative events, not least through social support. And they can find ways of crafting jobs so they are more meaningful. You know, that collective effort can be constructive. But as I think L'Oreal sees well, the opportunities for collective coping do vary a great deal between occupations, depending on the nature of tasks, organisational structure, and policies. And a lot of that depends upon the stability of the workforce, whether people are working in teams and so on. I mean, it's much more difficult if people are in a very individualised work setting to get that type of collective coping. But even more fundamentally, it's arguable that capacity for collective coping is being undermined by the increased individualisation at work. People are increasingly working on their own with specific work tasks. There's greater mobility, which is designed to enhance flexibility at work. The amount of time people have to have breaks and discussion at work is being steadily eroded. And there's greater competition, personal competition, between employees. So some of the sort of infrastructural foundations of collective coping at work may be disappearing, and this may be becoming less powerful as a potential mechanism for dealing with psychosocial stress. Employee voice and involvement in decision-making. Well, this is premised on the view that dialogue between managers and employees is the best way to create working conditions that protect from psychosocial risks and are sustainable in the longer term. And moreover, it produces a greater sense of procedural justice, which moderates psychosocial risks. But of course, it may threaten long-standing organisational authority cultures, and it may be seen as threatening competitiveness by increasing costs due to the changes that have to be carried out within the work organisation. But the research evidence here is interesting, and I want to show you two charts. The first is from a British national survey, which I was involved in, and it looks at the effects of being in an organisation where employees have considerable voice, a high level of influence over decisions about work organisation, compared to those where they have low voice over organisational changes. And you've got sort of three categories of sort of fear, what I call fear at work. Fear of losing your job, fear of unjust treatment, arbitrary dismissal, victimisation or discrimination, and here fear of what one might call loss of job status, being moved aside into a lower paid job, or a job where you have less control over what happens, or less skilled job, or a less interesting job. And what is interesting here, I think, is that the pattern is absolutely consistent across these different sources of anxiety that people can have at work. That if people are in organisations where employees can have considerable say over the way work is organised, they are much less likely to experience these types of anxieties than those who are in organisations where employees are not given that sort of voice. And if we turn to France, and I'm borrowing here a chart, I'm very grateful to him for letting me use it today, which was prepared by Thomas Coutreau in Dares, who is responsible for the conditions de travail surveys in France. And here he's showing the reactions or the effects of organizational change on people's psychological well-being measured by the World Health Organization scale. And what he shows here is if you take those who have been in an organization where there's been recent organizational change, they're more likely to experience psychological distress than the average. You can see that rises. But the really interesting part here in the chart is what happens at if the organization gives different levels of participation in decisions about organizational change. And you can see if you're an organization where employees are consulted and listened to, actually that risk is very much lower than the average risk for those experiencing organizational change, and indeed is lower than the average for the workforce as a whole, taking people who have or have not experienced such change. So there is some evidence that this type of way of handling psychosocial risks might be effective, at least for employees. And finally, increased regulative control is premised on the view that many employers tend to be unaware of the issues or simply reluctant to introduce change. So, in fact, the previous solution is difficult to implement. And I think both the French and the Nordic examples suggest initiatives by government and social partners can have an agenda-setting effect. You know, they can increase the visibility of these issues in a way which makes people think about them more within their individual companies and their workplaces. And of course, in France, it's been shown that this can be enhanced by triggering off collective bargaining and collective negotiation about these issues. But of course, there is this concern that increased regulative controls may reduce international competitiveness and be difficult to implement. And I think the most interesting answer to that is actually the Nordic countries. Because the Nordic countries have shown particularly innovative attempts to introduce improvements in work design. They introduced early the extension of health and safety to include risks for psychological health. They've given very strong regulative support for the role of works councils with respect to work organisation, and they generated a programme of work design reform through extensive subsidies for workplace dialogue around that issue. And what the evidence shows us is that jobs are better designed to reduce psychosocial risks in at least 3 of these countries, Denmark, Finland, and Norway, although I don't think the evidence shows that for Sweden. And the other interesting thing about the Nordic countries is, of course, nobody is saying that they're low on labour productivity or competitiveness. These are countries which economically are doing very well, despite these reforms. But look at the differences, the comparisons here. If we take work pressures, the work pressure is very similar between the Nordic countries and other countries. Indeed, the highest level of work pressure is to be found in Britain and Denmark in 2015 in this survey. But if you take job control, which is the other crucial thing, remember this argument that actually you can manage work pressure as long as you've got control over your job, you can see that the 3 Nordic countries are well above the EU average and well above France and Britain. So they've introduced reforms which basically increase people's control over their tasks at work. And if we just look at those combined categories of people in that category of high demand but low control, you can see that those risk categories are lower in each of those 3 Nordic countries than they are taking the EU as a whole and taking France, but particularly, of course, Britain, as we saw. So there does seem to be some efficacy in the Nordic countries' policies, and it's achieved without a significant loss of international competitiveness. So some conclusions. Well, taking the first part of the talk, I think there's now persuasive research evidence that aspects of the work environment, the quality of work, constitute psychosocial risks that undermine psychological and physical health. And this is a social problem that has to be taken very seriously by policymakers and all others concerned. Second, I think the Franco-British comparison suggests that the trends and types of employee at risk can be influenced by the policy priorities of national governments and the institutional structures of the labour market. And my third point, relating to the third section, is that the Nordic examples suggest that a combination of central initiatives for reform and workplace dialogue are likely to be the most effective way of promoting improvements in work quality and a reduction in psychosocial risks. Well, thank you very much.